Welcome to this short video regarding forces and joints. And we will be examining some of the concepts behind utilizing our physical nature, our bodies, and the concepts that are used in Tai Chi. So let's just jump right into it. You can break up the types of forces or the way forces are observed in a number of different ways. You may have two forces working together and you get like a friction. Then you might have just the natural force of gravity pulling on a force. The common thing that we observe is that you will be pushing something, like this example of the person pushing the wheelbarrow. Then there's the compression or spring force. And this is an interesting one where you're going through a fluid like air or water, and you have this drag force that will actually lift the airplane up into the air. So you can create changes in elevation just by this, where the drag force interacts a liquid with a solid. This is an interesting one. They call it a normal force here, but I call it the resting or meditative state. So your normal state has a kind of a neutral stance to it. Okay, and when you are moving, you get momentum. So you get this resting momentum kind of thing. These last two here I find are interesting, the magnetic force and the electric force. And some of you may know that magnetism and electricity go together. You can't have one without the other. So where you have electricity, you have magnetism. And this was a little discussion that maybe we'll have on a different presentation about the use of Chi in the body and how there's a electrical component to it, and of course a magnetism component. But today we'll just stick to forces. And so the thing with about a force is that they're extremely predictable. They always go in straight lines. So here's an example. We break a force up. We can talk about the head of the force, which is the direction, where is it pointed. And notice they have an arrowhead. It goes directly to a specific location. And then the magnitude or duration of the force. There's a direction, it's aimed in a specific way. And then, of course, there's the tail where it kind of peters out. So the key here that I think is important is that there's a direction, there's a point, and an end tail to it. And it's always in a straight line until you start to combine more than one force. And in Tai Chi, we will always be dealing with multiple forces. And here's an example of where you can create a third force that's bigger than the two applied. So this example might be where you're pushing with your two hands, force 1 and force 2. And the resulting force is the sum of them both. And notice that the force has a bigger duration, right? So this is used a lot in martial arts. We see this happening a lot, and here you see an example of three people. And you have a person force 1 and person force 2, both pushing on this third person in the blue in the middle. And this diagram here gives you an example of what would happen. If it was just force 1, that person would be pushed in a straight line that way. If it was just force 2, the person would be pushed in a straight line straight ahead. But because the two forces are being applied and we assume equally, this person is going to go off in a 45-degree angle. Like the resolution, the sum of these two forces produces a third direction. Very important concept in Tai Chi where we apply two forces in sort of direction to get a third result that we wouldn't normally expect. You can do other things with forces. You can multiply or you can increase a force with the use of a pendulum or a pivot point. And notice here that the weight-bearing end of it is always close to the pivot point. So if you want to manipulate something or someone, you want to put your pivot point close to where their maximum weight is, and then where you're going to apply the effort will be some distance away. So that's an interesting concept, utilized a lot in Tai Chi. The other thing that happens with forces is that you can conserve energy by utilizing pulleys. And the way that you configure the pulleys or these joints will determine how much force you have to apply. So in the first example, notice that there's a rigid fixed point. There's two of them, and one pulley is attached to the object, and the third one, the second point, is attached to the, in this case, think of it as a ceiling. When you pull on one point, it causes these two pulleys. The net result is that the amount of work required to lift that block is significantly reduced. Also note that by adding more pulleys, you can actually decrease significantly the amount of work that's done. Another example of that would be where you use hydraulics. So here you see that with a 10 Newton force, or a 10 magnitude force is applied, is able to lift a 100 magnitude force. So a smaller force using hydraulics can push a bigger force. Now the note to put here is, notice that the circumference of the smaller one is measured, goes through a fluid, and that fluid, the pressure from that smaller one, is put into a larger area. And the initial example here is in the martial art. You're going to apply a small force and spread it out over a bigger area, and each point in that bigger area has the same amount of force as the smaller one. Let me see if I can rephrase that. Say if there's 10 ounces of force in this smaller surface, and it is 1 unit. So you get 10 being pushed on 1 unit of measurement, going through a liquid to a surface that has 10 of these circles. Okay? Each one of those 10 will have the same amount of force applied to it. So that's where you get the multiplication. So the interesting thing here is we can combine this two-force idea, generating a third force, with the idea of creating a wave. When you create a wave motion, you can use the concepts of soft and hard, or empty space and solid space, to create a wave. Now, when you do that, you change the direction of the force, which would normally be going in a straight line, but the moment you decrease the angle of it and create a wave, that force has to change direction. Okay? This is similar to what happens when you have a weight and you spin it in a circle. You get a force moving away from you of that weighted object, right? The centripetal force. And that's a very powerful force. So you can create that in a martial art. So let's look at this, try to combine all of these in Tai Chi. To do this, we will have to use our joints. I'll just mention here that there are sort of 3 basic types of joints. There are joints like in your skull that are primarily fibrous, and there are joints that have like a cartilage and a pad in between them, like your spine, right? And then the third type is one that has a synovial fluid in it, that has a sac, And this typical for these would be like ball joints. So the three types of joints are like the fibrous joint. It's not very much movement. There is some, but they're more to allow for expansion. And then the cartilage type of joint, such as in the spine, and then the synovial joint. The difference with the synovial is that it actually has a fluid and has a much more complicated joint and has the most movement. So let's look at the basic types of joints. So you have a joint that will allow for rotation, and you have a joint that will allow for sort of a combination of rotation and flexing. So these are your 6 basic joints. And the key here is that each one of these joints has the ability to act like a pulley, to act like a lever. So some of these joints, particularly the hinge, are like levers to give you a fulcrum, a work advantage. And some are like rotational to give you that wave type motion. So let's put it all together. So in Tai Chi, you have, many of you may have heard me mention this, you have the 4 directions, front and back, or left and right. And those 4 directions, front and back, left and right, can be broken into 4 more directions, right? Which is the sort of 45-degree angle of that. So this is basically what we use in Tai Chi. You notice that we have the square here to give you all 4 points. Now, the key here is that we will be pushing in a straight line in one of these directions, either straight back or straight front, or straight left or straight right, or on the diagonal corner, right? So let's look at how we would apply these with the basic 4 forces. The basic way we do this is you doing something called a pen. And what the pen does, it adds the wave into the straight line. So here in this example, you can see this person is pushing, but they're using a pen, so they would incorporate a downward then an upward, like a wave motion in that. And that has a tremendous effect on the power that you can do this. So if you're trying to disperse someone's force, you can do it with a pen. So let's take a closer look at this. There's something called a movement called the Pen Lu Jian, of which the first movement is called a pen. So in this one, when we're doing the pen, notice that the person's right arm is kind of pushing straight out, but the left arm is pushing down. And notice that the front leg is dropping down. So you get this downward motion and forward motion, those 2 forces, and that will generate a pen. The next thing that happens is after the pen, there's a lu. And what the lu does, it's coming back to that back foot, and it's almost like a retreat, but it's a turning. That's that centripetal force that turns the opponent to away from you. And after lu, there's something called a ji. And notice here that the front leg is going downward force and the front is going out. Most of the force here would be going through the 2 hands. So this is your G force. And then finally, there's the an. So the first part of the an is a retreat, or basically like a retreat is the best way to explain it. Where the person will rock back and take the weight to force it, and notice the downward motion of that. Then what happens? The person pushes out with both hands to do the an motion. Now, these motions would normally be done in sequence in a flurry flowing, where you would go from the pen, the Lu, the Ji, and then the roll back and motion. So those are the basic Pen Lu Jian motion of Tai Chi, utilizing all of your joints. The key here is, I'd like to point out that this particular motion was originally the first basic motions of Tai Chi, and were practiced for many, many years, and then other movements were added on. So that's just a little description to talk about joints and forces and how they are applied in Tai Chi. Thank you very much, and see you soon.